Thank you, Jeremy, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Unlike the two ladies who you're hearing from today, I have never written a novel. I have no wish to write a novel. Indeed, I've never written a play, nor have any wish to write a play, or even a poem. I've always been interested in what makes writers tick. In other words, the creatures themselves. Now, at school, I was told by my English master, it's very simple. It's 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. And he was wrong. I've discovered that a career writing rich biographies of the sort of louche characters Jeremy has referred to, it's 10% inspiration, 40% perspiration, and 50% alcohol. Now, I soon realised, writing rich biographies, that yes, it was about the people and their loves and their disastrous lives, usually, but also the places where they were. And most successful writers, particularly novelists, have an extraordinary ability to capture the sense of a place, whether it's Isherwood in Berlin before the Second World War, or a group of people I've tended to concentrate on in recent years who gathered in Soho after the war. Of course, Oscar himself had started that trail. It was in Kettner's, in Romilly Street, that Oscar Wilde feasted with panthers, as he described having supper with the valets and grooms who were his favourite companions when he was not out dining with duchesses. But it was after the Second World War that really Soho came into its strong being. And it was because of the extraordinary number of places that were there and people who gathered at those places. One was a pub known as the French, indeed now it's called the French pub, though in those days it was the York Minster. And it was called the French for two reasons. One, because the proprietor Gaston Berlaymont was indeed French origin, but largely because General de Gaulle and the Free French had gathered there. Sometimes visitors to London would wander in a bit mystified, but they had Pernod on tap, not beer. And in the French were a number of regulars, some of whom had been in Paris before the war, not least Nina Hamnet, a painter now much forgotten, alas, because she was actually a woman painter of great talent, but and indeed had been a model for sculptors and artists in Paris before the war. She was a very glamorous woman then, not by the time she hit Soho in the 1950s. Poor little creature, rather shriveled by age, who sat on a bar stool by the bar, rattling an empty cocoa tin, inveigling people who came in to drop some coppers in so she could buy her next gin. But she was like all of the people in Soho who survived Soho, a good raconteur. When someone once asked who she was, she declared, "You know me, dear, I'm in the V&A with the left tit knocked off." Because indeed, there was indeed a bust of her in the Victoria and Albert Museum. But of course, one of the greatest soaks and also greatest talents of the time was Dylan Thomas, the professional Welshman who was brought up in uplands, that most English of Swansea's suburbs, speaking cut-glass English, but soon realised when he hit London that it would be a good idea if he wasn't the professional Welshman, lining up his pints of beer along the counters. And you may remember in those days there were these strange opening hours that we had, brought in during the First World War to make sure that munitions workers were not completely drunk when they went back after their lunch break. And so the pubs shut at 2, except for some bizarre reason in Fitzrovia, just north of Oxford Street, where it was 2:30. So there was a sort of drift, rather like a line of ducklings going over Oxford Street from one to the other. But all was not lost for the genuine soaks, because there were afternoon drinking clubs. the most famous of which now, sadly, no longer extant, being the colony room in the 50s and 60s, ruled over by an extraordinary woman, a butch Portuguese lesbian by the name of Muriel Belcher. Indeed, most of the habitués referred to it as Muriels. And she, like many in Soho, had a pretty vicious tongue, as well as being quite a wit. She automatically turned people's genders around. Even the German Führer was contemptuously referred to as Miss Hitler. Poor John Brain, when he had his success coming from nowhere, down in London with his first novel, Room at the Top, was taken to the colony room and she asked, "And who's that?" She was told, and she said, "Huh, not much room in her top, I wouldn't have thought." And it was in the colony room that the greatest artists of the 20th century met. These are the greatest artists who were based in London. Muriel was a very shrewd thing. She met the young Francis Bacon, who had grown up in Ireland, gone off to Paris, and ended up in London as a penniless young artist, largely self-taught, producing pictures which most people thought absolutely hideous, screamingly unusual for that period. She recognised talent, and she also recognised that here was someone who could bring in customers. And so she paid Francis Bacon £10 a week to bring customers, like a tout really, from the streets of Soho into the colony room. And he brought people like Lucian Freud, John Minton, many of the great artistic figures. I think he must be roaring with laughter in his grave to know that now his pictures, which previously people ridiculed, now sell for £50 million each. So Soho built this extraordinary reputation as a place where people came, yes, to drink, but also to exchange ideas. There were some, yes, who were professional, down-on-the-heel people who were on the way out. Indeed, many of you will be familiar with the old Spectator columnist Geoffrey Bernard, who had the column Low Life. There was Tacky, the rather sort of obnoxiously very rich Greek socialite who wrote High Life, and Geoffrey Bernard, who wrote this sort of weekly column that was a long suicide note, essentially. And he spent most of his time in the Coach and Horses pub run by Norman Bailey, the man who joyfully called himself the rudest landlord in Britain, and proved it by the way he treated people. And Geoffrey, when he was well enough, would write his column, but all too often a little notice would appear in the Spectator saying, "Geoffrey Bernard is unwell." And indeed, a brilliant play was made from that, with Peter O'Toole uncannily portraying Geoffrey Bernard, and it had a huge West End success. And indeed, the colony room in particular, even after Muriel Belcher was dead and it passed on to her barman and then on to his barman, was still drawing in people of talent. Tracy Emin and several of the so-called young British artists had that as one of their favourite drinking places. But I would say the clientele fell into two types. There were those, like Francis Bacon, who got up early, worked extremely hard, and then came into Soho at lunchtime and just partied for the rest of the day. And others, who perhaps a little hungover from the night before, got up at lunchtime, went into Soho and partied, particularly if they had independent means like John Minton. So, have I really answered the question, what makes writers tick apart from pure alcohol? And I would say it is largely two things. First is the place where they are, which can be like pre-war Berlin, extraordinarily stimulating environment, or indeed Soho, stimulating for the right sort of people. But it's also the people with whom they interact. Because writers, although most of us spend most of our time not at glamorous literary festivals, but alone in a room, in my case with the curtains drawn, in order not to get distracted from whatever I'm doing at the time, we all do need people. We get inspiration not just from ourselves, but it's not just biographers who get inspiration from other human beings as well. Thank you.